We'll be getting started here in about a minute. Let everyone join in. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kevin Mickey. I am a former president of URISA and the current co-chair of URISA's Professional Resilience Work Group. I'd like to welcome you today to this webinar, which is part of a continuing monthly series on community resilience that is sponsored by URISA. If you are not already familiar with URISA, I'd like to welcome you to this event, one of many. URISA itself is a multidisciplinary geospatial organization that provides education and training and lots of opportunities to get connected within the professional community. We advocate for geospatial challenges and issues. We provide lots of different resources, including this educational opportunity, and we are there to serve, but we do that collaboratively with our colleagues within the organization and elsewhere. And I welcome you all today to this event, and hope if this is your first URISA event that you'll get a great deal out of it and come back and join us for future offerings as well. We are joined today by Dr. John Finn. He's an associate professor of geography and the chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. Dr. Finn's going to be sharing some really great information with us about Seawalls, managed retreat and climate gentrification, following on from a phenomenal keynote presentation that he did at a past URISA conference that those of us who were fortunate to attend really enjoyed, and I have expectations that the same will be true today. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of the session. I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A that you'll find by hovering over the bottom of your screen. So with that, Dr. Finn, I'm going to turn this over to you, and thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Can you hear? Is my audio coming through okay?
Yep, you're in great shape.
All right, so let me just share my screen here. And then I'll just say, yeah, thanks very, very much for the invitation to join you all today. I'm an urban geographer, and I'm not a GIS professional, so I always preface my talks when I come and speak with folks at URISA that I feel a little bit out of place. I have a little bit of, well, I should say a lot of nerves going into this because I'm speaking to a room full of experts in this field, and I come at questions of GIS and questions of urban planning from the perspective of an urban geographer thinking more conceptually than necessarily kind of thinking in the weeds of the software and from the planning perspective. So I hope you'll kind of forgive me in advance and bear with me, as I know some of you have really outstanding expertise in these areas. I am a native of New Mexico, but I transplanted to Virginia about a dozen years ago to the Tidewater region of Southeast Virginia. And it's a region that's really profoundly impacted by the risks and realities of climate change, especially through sea level rise and through hurricanes and other kind of flood and storm surge related risks. My research doesn't address those things in the first instance. My work is historically about the intersection of racist and racially discriminatory housing policies in the past, and how that history continues to impact American urban society in the present day. And a lot of my work hasn't specifically focused on climate change and climate risk and the intersection of historical discrimination in housing in the past and climate risk in the present and future. But in the last couple of months, I've really been thinking about the implications of a history of discriminatory housing in the past in terms of all of the climate related infrastructure that we're beginning to build out in the context of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. These two major pieces of legislation that are going to be putting in the future, in the near future, a lot of money in terms of rebuilding our cities to make them more climate resilient. So what I want to talk about today, I want to briefly cover the history of residential racial segregation in the US. I want to think about this narrowly then in terms of the contemporary impacts, in terms of the intersection of race and home value. And then I want to look, I'm going to use three examples of seawalls, of managed retreat, and of climate gentrification to think about the implications of this history for the future, for where we're going from here. And so if you come to CNU and take my course in urban geography, we spend a lot of time talking about this first question, the history of residential racial segregation in the US. But really, this history, and so I'm going to try to get through it in just a couple of minutes here. So I'm going to obviously be leaving a lot out, but I'll try to get the big key items. But really, the history of racial segregation in the US is a history in white communities of positive public works investments, of the subsidization of home ownership, and of ongoing regulatory protection of white home values through things like zoning and whatnot. And in Black communities, the history of racial segregation in the US is a history of negative or absent public works investments, of thwarting pathways to home ownership, and of ongoing discrimination in the housing sector in the present day. And so really what we're looking at from 35,000 feet is investments in both in communities and in home ownership opportunities in white neighborhoods, and disinvestments in both the communities and in opportunities for pathways to home ownership in Black communities. Let me just give a couple of kind of historical, I'll put a little bit of historical meat on the bones, so to speak here. A lot of you have probably heard of the idea of redlining. This is a policy that goes back to the 1930s, to the New Deal era, where the government was deciding where to invest money, public money, in terms of helping to save homeowners from foreclosure. They created these maps that rated neighborhoods into one of four grades, the highest grades being green and blue on the map, the lowest grade, hazardous, was red on the map. And these were hazardous in terms of their worthiness for investment in housing. And every single, in the case of Hampton Roads, every single neighborhood has a data sheet that goes with it. And every single data sheet has quite a bit of both quantitative and also qualitative information about each particular neighborhood. And you can really, what's interesting about these maps is this map was made in 1939 or 1940. And what's so interesting is you see that these maps are already describing extensive disinvestment in predominantly Black redlined neighborhoods. You can see that right here, the majority of streets are dirt surfaced, full of ruts and mud holes. They're unsightly, they're poorly lit. They're already embedded in this map is evidence of previous long-term disinvestment in Black neighborhoods. And then they also delineated the lines of where future investments would flow and would not flow. Future investments based on these maps would flow into the predominantly white neighborhoods that have already received high levels of investment, and future investments would flow away from or would not flow into redlined neighborhoods, predominantly Black neighborhoods that were already at that point the sites of long-term disinvestment. If we fast forward to the Great Depression, or excuse me, we fast forward from the Great Depression to the post-war era, the build out of public housing. You can see that on the one hand, we built extensive public housing, both low-rise and high-rise public housing in redlined neighborhoods that would be predominantly Black. These would be segregated Black public housing projects in the soon-to-be deindustrializing cores of American cities. Well, at the same time, we were building out and subsidizing white homeownership in what became kind of the quintessential American suburb. In these suburban neighborhoods, like the quintessential Levittown on Long Island, these suburban neighborhoods were explicitly kept white. White flight was not an accident. These neighborhoods were explicitly kept white through the use of what are called racially restrictive covenants. These are covenants in the deeds of properties that explicitly said that the said property shall not be sold, leased, given, or devised to a person of African descent or a corporation, a majority of whose stock is owned or controlled by persons of African descent. That is to say, while we were building segregated Black public housing in the urban core of cities for African American communities and families, we were simultaneously building out the American suburb and limiting it to white families exclusively. Continue to fast forward through the period of urban renewal, we see the ongoing disruption and displacement of Black neighborhoods and Black communities through big major public works projects. For example, Deborah Archer recently traced in what's a really outstanding law review article, the pathway of American urban interstates cutting almost exclusively through Black and other non-white communities. If you go to a city just up the road from me in Richmond, Virginia, this is a map from 1923, delineating the Richmond's Black population, and the late 1950s Interstate 95 cut the heart out of the historically Black Jackson Ward neighborhood in Richmond, and what you can see here, an aerial photograph from the era. Continuing into the present day, this is not just a story of disinvestment in Black neighborhoods. This is also a story of protecting investments in predominantly white neighborhoods. And we see that play out through, for example, exclusionary zoning, single-family zoning restrictions and regulations that keep home values high in oftentimes in predominantly white neighborhoods. And then while we think of redlining as a thing of the past, something from the 1930s and the 1940s and the construction of public housing in the urban inner city in the 1950s and 1960s, we still see in the present day, now usually through the actions of individuals and companies, we see ongoing discrimination that continues to create these kinds of disinvestment pressures and these deflationary pressures in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So if you look at almost all of the big banks, this is a screenshot of Wells Fargo, but Bank of America and Chase have also had to settle recently similar class action lawsuits where they were giving subprime interest rates to Black home borrowers. And what that really just means, if a lot of you, I imagine, have bought a home, and if you bought a home like I did before the run up in interest rates, you could get an interest rate of 3 or 4 or 5%. A subprime interest rate might be 10 or 11 or 12%. And the difference between a 4% interest rate and a 10% interest rate translates into more than $1,000 per month that has to be put towards servicing the loan rather than towards investing in the property. And what that means is that the individuals, in this case, African-American mortgage borrowers, would get much more expensive loans, thus pushing them into lower home value neighborhoods. And this is happening right in the present day. And then literally last month, a major lawsuit settled in Baltimore of 2 Johns Hopkins University professors for discrimination in home appraisals. So we see ongoing, not just a history of discrimination in the housing sector. And this is not just a history, it is certainly a history of discriminatory housing policies emanating from the federal, state, and local governments, but this is also a history of discriminatory housing practices by realtors, by urban planners, by banks, and by everyone else involved in the kind of housing sector. And what this constitutes basically then is a century-long process of disinvestment in Black neighborhoods with a kind of a paired investment in predominantly suburban, predominantly white neighborhoods. So that's, forgive me for being so quickly moving through that so quickly, but that's the history that we're looking at. This is a historical context that we're looking at. What does this mean in the present day? And I have a whole different talk and a couple of papers that I've written about the impacts in terms of environment and health questions. But today, I really, in order to get into talking about the impacts in terms of climate change and the implications for climate change and climate resilient infrastructure, I really want to focus this second question on the impacts in terms of race and home values. So if we're thinking about the last 100 years of housing policies and housing practices being a history of intentional discrimination that led to the long-term disinvestment in Black neighborhoods, what this has created in the present day is a really wide, what social scientists call a racial wealth gap. Whereas while the median Black family in the US has a wealth of about $45,000, the median white family in the US has wealth of about $285,000. That's an 85% gap between the median white and median Black family. And in the US, when we're talking about medians, you all know your stats, I'm sure. Just median just means half of white families have more, half of families have less net worth in this case. And when we're looking at medians, we're looking at the solid middle class, and most middle class assets in the US are wrapped up in the single home that a family owns and lives in. We're not talking about second and third homes. We're not talking about yachts. We're not talking about vast stock portfolios. The median family in the US has almost all of their wealth in the one home that they own and that they live in. And the result in the present day of 100 years of discriminatory policies and practices in the housing sector is an 85% gap between median white net worth and median Black net worth. Now we can dive into that a little bit deeper. And I did some data, I worked on some data on this just using ACS data, looking at the intersection between race and home value in urban and suburban census tracts in the state of Virginia. And what you can see is a positive and statistically significant positive correlation between whiteness and home value in the state of Virginia. And you see an even stronger and equally statistically significant negative correlation between Blackness and home value. Basically, for every percent increase a census tract is African American, there's a negative impact on the home value of the median home value in that census tract. When you're looking at this in terms of just the Hampton Roads region, we're looking here about 335 census tracts that covers almost every single populated area in the Hampton Roads region, an area of about 1.5 million people. An even stronger positive correlation between race and home value, and an even stronger than that negative correlation between Blackness and home value. And when you adjust that, when you run a multivariate regression to adjust for household income, even controlling for household income, every percentage increase of a census tract's African American population translates into a drop of $700 in the median home value of that census tract. So you can end up going from 100% white to 100% Black census tract of equal incomes, of families of equal income. That would be a drop of $70,000 in terms of home value. This is I think, in a little bit more detail than just that one chart on the racial wealth gap. This is the impact on home values and race of this long history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. And then when you look at that, what that looks like on a map. This map, there's a lot going on here, and you'll have to forgive me. I'm not I wouldn't put the word cartographer before my name, but what we're looking at here is the percent white is the coloration on this map, and then the height of the column over each block group. This is using the most recent data available, the ACS 5-year estimates, 2018 to 2022. What the height is the median home value. And then when you split it out in Hampton Roads, the median home value is about right in the median, metro wide is about $305,000. What you can see is that over 70% of the area of the region's Black population lives in census block groups with below median home values. Whereas if you look at the population in above median home value census block groups, it's over 70% white and less than 13% African American. So we can see basically what these show is the production of a racialized economic inequality. The history of racist housing policies and practices in our past have created an economic inequality in our present that is highly sorted by race as well. So basically what I'm making an argument here for is that it's impossible to disentangle racial inequality from economic inequality. Racial inequality is at the root of the creation through investment and disinvestment based along racial lines. That's the root of our ongoing present day racialized economic inequality that we can see demonstrated in these maps. Okay, that's a lot so far. I'm on to part 3. What are the implications for this in the present day for building climate resilient cities? What does this all mean in terms of how can we build out our cities of the future on this framework of the past, these landscapes of inequality that we have inherited from the past. And I think one single idea kind of focuses my mind on all of this work. And that idea is this: if we ignore the history of discriminatory policies and practices in our past that have created the landscapes of inequality that we inhabit today, we will quite literally cement into the future, these racially and environmentally unjust landscapes of the present. That is to say, I think, and there's not to be too dramatic about it, but I really do think that we stand kind of at a precipice right now in this moment. We have committed literally trillions of dollars to infrastructure building in the coming decades, and we stand at the end point of a 100 or so year history of profound racial discrimination in housing that has created really deep racialized economic inequality in our cities. And what we find is the way that we make decisions on what money to spend on what kinds of projects, where, those decisions have an awful lot to do with the underlying value of the land. But the underlying value of the land isn't divorced. It can't be divorced from this history of racial discrimination that has led some land values to be very high in predominantly white areas and other land values to be very low in predominantly Black areas. History produced this. This is not an accident. History produced this, and we're about to spend loads and loads and loads of money using cost-benefit analyses to decide what neighborhoods to save, what neighborhoods to retreat from, where to build walls, where to raise homes, how to reroute highways. And we're going to build all of this on top of a profoundly unequal city that is the result itself of intentional discrimination accumulated throughout the last 100 years of housing practices and policies. Sorry to harp on that point a little bit. I think that's a really important point, and we're already seeing how this is playing out in the context of Norfolk, Virginia. So I'm going to go through now kind of three examples where I think we need to pay close attention to this history and the production of racialized economic inequality in our cities and what that means for building a more climate resilient landscape. Example one I'll give you is Norfolk's seawall project. And I snapped this picture about a year ago. This is high tide on a rainy but not a particularly unusual kind of day. And I think this picture gets very nicely at both the fact of really profound tidal flooding. This is a floodwater that has come up over a park area, over a sidewalk, across the street, over another sidewalk, and up the steps of this home that is for sale. And these folks are evidently considering buying it on an unfortunate day, I guess, if you're the home seller. Unfortunate that potential buyers come by there when the floodwaters are 3 steps up the way into your house. But this also doesn't only show the flood risk hazard, but I think the fact of the house being for sale gets at the idea that in these areas, some areas that are at risk of flooding also have really quite high underlying economic value. That particular house is located right here on Mulberry Arch in the city of Norfolk, and it sold last year for almost $1 million. And this whole neighborhood is one of the most at-risk neighborhoods in Norfolk for flooding, and also one of the most expensive in terms of home values. Each one of these homes along here is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 to $1.5 million. And so a plan that Norfolk has come up with, not just for this neighborhood, but for the entire city, is called the Norfolk Seawall Project. Some people call it the 2075 the flood or seawall project. And what you can see, this map is produced by the city of Norfolk with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and this map shows 2075 flood risk. For context, that house that we were looking at is right about there, and then it's no longer a proposed wall. A deal has been inked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build this $10 billion wall to protect the city of Norfolk from storm surges associated with increasingly strong tropical storms. And what you can see is that a whole lot of the city, the north west corner here, that's the naval base at Norfolk, which is federal property, so not a part of what the city is working on. But other than that, the city has largely managed to build out this wall, this $10 billion flood wall that will protect the overwhelming majority of the city. What's happened, though, if you'll notice, is one part, the historically Black neighborhoods of Berkeley and Compostela, are just decidedly left outside of that wall. And I want to think about why that is. Well, there's an environmental, or excuse me, an economic feasibility study as a part of an environmental impact statement done for this project. And there was a really simple, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers uses a really simple cost benefit analysis. And looking at the neighborhoods of Berkeley and Compostela, they looked at the cost versus the benefit. And in these two neighborhoods, the cost of building the wall to protect those two neighborhoods simply wasn't worth it in terms of the protected land value that would result from building that wall. And they came to the conclusion that structural measures do not show economic justification and thus are not considered reasonable. Basically, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers used a cost-benefit analysis that looked at the assessed values of properties versus the projected cost of building the wall, and said that these two neighborhoods in particular, the underlying value of those homes are not worth the cost that it would take to extend the seawall to protect those two homes. It's interesting, those exact neighborhoods were mapped on this 1940 redlining map, the very same one I showed you all at the top of the screen. And what if we look at this is that exact same neighborhood, and what it said specifically. This is a neighborhood that was then 95% Black. There was institutional dumping prevalent. Streets were dirt surface, no sidewalks. All streets were poorly lit. And industry is adjacent, and the area is generally poor and undesirable in appearance. Already in 1940, when this map was produced, this was a neighborhood of extensive public disinvestment and environmental contamination. Fast forward nearly 100 years, fast forward 85 years ensuing of continued disinvestment, continued blockage or thwarting of home ownership, continued lack of investment, and continued environmental dumping. And we come to a point where here we are, nearly 100 years later, essentially saying the exact same thing. This area, because of the history of disinvestment, isn't worth investing in the future. This, I think, is a pretty profound example of history repeating itself. Example number two, I call it Newport News's urban wetland interface. And this is a picture, this is not a picture that I shot, this is a picture from one of the local newspapers that recently did a story on an area in the city of Newport News, which is the city where I live, where there's extensive flooding, and the city has had a targeted buyout program where they buy out owners who want to sell, and then they let that land essentially become a wetland, and it's part of a broader strategy, kind of under the rubric of managed retreat, of retreating from flood-prone coastal areas to allow those areas to become wetlands, in order to help save other parts of the urban wetland interface. To give a sense of what that feels like and looks like on the ground, back in the fall, I happened to have an hour off one morning. It was raining. It wasn't raining particularly hard. It was not during a hurricane, but it was high tide, and I drove down there, and I shot that video. That is, for people who are bird nerds, that is a yellow-crowned night heron fishing in the yard, and you can see that this is a, if not daily, this is a kind of a weekly situation. And you can understand then why cities have to be thinking critically about what they're going to do with properties and swaths of the city that are at these urban wetland interfaces. And so here it is on a map. If you add in the NOAA data with their 6 feet above current mean high water, we're looking at this area right in here. This is called the Salters Creek area. And this is an area that was in fact historically redlined on that very same redlining map going all the way back to 1940. They already said that this eastern boundary, that is the eastern boundary of the city of Newport News, is adjacent to Salters Creek, near which the land is low and inclined to be swampy. Already, this was an environmentally hazardous area, historically redlined. Historically African American, and today still, the census tracts that surround Salters Creek are over 80% African American, and median home value is far lower than the regional average of $305,000. Median home values in these census tracts don't exceed $180,000. And it is precisely here where the city of Newport News has put into place, as a part of its hazard mitigation plan, a buyout program. And the city has actually bought out 80 properties, largely, most of them, about 65 of the properties citywide that Newport News has bought out are precisely in this area surrounding the flood-prone areas of Salters Creek. One of the problems here, though, if we think about this in connection with it, I should say, this project is not actually connected to the Seawall project. There are different cities, different municipalities, different money. But if we think of it conceptually connected, what we're looking at is, with the Seawall project, figuring out what neighborhoods are the most valuable to protect from rising seas, and with buyout programs, what neighborhoods are the cheapest in terms of their economic value, where there is also flooding, that you can get the most bang for your buck in terms of buying out properties. And so what we see is and this is been shown in peer-reviewed literature around the country. What we see is that there's evidence, strong evidence, that in high value neighborhoods that have high levels of flood risk, that's where money goes to protect and save those neighborhoods, with flood walls, with money to raise homes, with all different kinds of infrastructure projects. And in this neighborhoods with high flood, the same the same high flood risk, but with lower home values, that because of the history of racial discrimination in housing tend to be overwhelmingly African American. Those are the areas where money is not spent to protect those homes, but rather money is spent, much less money. I think this whole thing is in the low millions of dollars to buy out these properties. Money is spent to buy out properties and displace residents, rather than spending on the flood wall in Norfolk the order of trillions of dollars to protect the value of those properties. Um, and so and there's been actually there's more we could really I could really get into the weeds on this, because they're not the buyout program is voluntary, and so we end up with one parcel being bought out, and then there's two homes that are still there, and then another parcel that's bought out, and the city takes down the home, but then the properties are overgrown. That it doesn't work to create a wetland if in the middle of the wetland there's three people trying to preserve their homes and their properties. And it's actually the haphazardness of this project, this buyout project, has received quite a lot of criticism from local residents, who say, basically, if you don't decide to sell your house, if you don't decide to be bought out, the buyout surrounding you, with each subsequent buyout that a neighbor takes, it further drives down the property values and further reduces the potential for income that you could get in a future buyout. So it's problematic in a lot of ways there. Finally, the third example that I have is Norfolk, and I'm going back across the water to the city of Norfolk to look at um, their overall kind of vision 2100, their comprehensive vision for a climate resilient city of the future. And Norfolk, I think, maybe more than most cities in the country, really faces an existential threat. Norfolk in particular has the 1-2 punch of rising seas and also subsiding land, that's translated, in the case of Norfolk, up to about 12 or 13 inches of net sea level rise since 1900. Um, and Sea levels are only rising only faster, while the land continues to subside. And so it is something that city leaders really have to think about, especially when city budgets, like most places in the US, city budgets are driven by property taxes. The city has a vested interest in protecting property values in order to protect the tax base for the city itself. So Vision 2100 is Norfolk's comprehensive plan for climate resilient future. And I'm only starting to get into this analysis, so this is almost kind of by way of concluding. I want to look through these four color-coded areas and think about what this means in terms of the history of the production of racialized economic inequality that I talked about before. So the city has first named the red zones on this map, not to be confused with redlined areas, but red zones on this map are areas of very high flood risk, but also very high economic value. They call these the kind of the economic drivers of the city. These neighborhoods, the areas here, are disproportionately white, and that is especially the case after the removal and redevelopment of about 2,200 units of public housing right in the area where I'm circling on my cursor. There's been a project over the last 3 years to demolish 2,200 units of public housing, and they're scattering those folks. I've been very critical and openly critical of this project. The effect has been that they're scattering these folks to the wind, um, as they rebuild many fewer than 2,200 units of mixed income commercial housing, basically market housing in this area. And I think most people think that the folks, the 2,200 families, about 5,500 people that lived in the three public housing projects that are currently being raised, most of those folks won't come back. And once those people are gone, a lot of them have already left. And once those folks are gone, the red zone on this map will be even more disproportionately white than the city as a whole. And I characterize this as kind of zones of protection. And this is a quote from the full Vision 2100 report, where they say Norfolk determined that these high valued areas should be secured with major flood control investments that protect from water while preserving access to it. These controls include flood walls, tide gates, and pumps, as well as green infrastructure. And we're already seeing that happen in this flood prone area where the public housing used to be located. The public housing suffered from flooding since when it was built in the 1950s, and it is now, after they've knocked down all the public housing, that they're putting in several major pump stations to help fix the flood problem, just as they're privatizing it and redeveloping it into mixed income housing. Second is the yellow area on the map, and these are areas that are mostly coastal areas with high levels of flood risk. A lot of this is residential rather than commercial areas, and this area is predominantly white. These are some of the more kind of sought after residential neighborhoods of the city, in Ocean View and Larchmont here, and some of these areas where the water and access to the coastline is an amenity, and which has helped to keep home values high. So these are coastal areas with high flood risk. These are areas that are disproportionately white, but they have what the city characterizes as fewer key community assets. Um, and these have become what you might call zones of retreat, where Norfolk plans to focus investments on infrastructure that extends resilience. I think it extends resilience temporarily into the future, while educating the public about the risks of recurrent flooding, and develop programs such as transferable development rights to help property owners recoup economic value lost to sea level rise. These are areas, I think that's a lot of bureaucratic language for saying these are areas that are likely going to need to be retreated from, but the city is going to try to put into place programs to help property owners, as they retreat from these areas, recoup their lost value. On the other hand, green areas are areas that are inland and they have lower flood risk. These are areas that much more likely to be historically redlined. These areas today are disproportionately African American, relatively high poverty, and these areas, as a result, are historically disinvested. And I've called these areas zones of climate gentrification. And to be clear, the zones of climate gentrification is my term. The city of Norfolk wouldn't characterize it that way, I don't think. But what I've said is that in this Vision 2100 documentation, that says that Norfolk aims to redevelop these areas with an eye towards transit-oriented urban centers that will be reasonably safer from flood risk, with proper planning, can accommodate projected increases in population. What this sounds like to just about any urban geographer in the academy anyway, is this is an area, basically a plan for gentrification. And when you look at it in the context of it, and this is classic gentrification, where it's disinvested inner city areas that then become the home both to outside investment and outside populations that come in, that end up having displacement pressures on the pre-existing indigenous population. And I'm pessimistic about this, and suspect that that's precisely what's going to happen. Finally, if we look at another set of inland neighborhoods, these are what the documentation terms stable neighborhoods with lower flood risk. These are areas that are racially proportionate to the city overall, and that have relatively lower average poverty rates. And these are what I would consider zones of preservation according to the city's documentation. Here, the city hopes to make investments that enhance neighborhood attractiveness while maintaining affordability. And so like I said, I'm in the middle of writing on kind of a larger analysis of this map, of this plan in general. But I think that I'm generally speaking, I'm troubled by essentially the plan for the climate resilient future is being built upon the landscapes of racial inequality that have been produced through the past 100 years of intentionally discriminatory policy and practice that have shaped our city in the present. And I think that I think that we need to, as geographers, as urban planners, as GIS professionals, we need to think about ways to do better, to be able to take into consideration into our cost benefit analyses, into our plans, into our resiliency infrastructure. We need to be able to conceptually and materially take into account this particular past and the way that it shapes the present and the way that we could be cementing into the future that discrimination of the past. So let me stop there. I would love to take any questions or to kind of clarify anything for folks. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
So it looks like we do have two questions. The one is fairly long, rather than actually we have three questions. They're popping up here real quick.
Good.
Do you just want to respond to them directly?
Sure. Yeah. All right. So I'll take them in order. I think. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the Q&A while I was presenting, so I'm just seeing it now for the first time. Here in South Florida, especially Broward County, um, this is always everybody. Do I need to read the question, or can everybody see it?
Everybody should be able to see the question, I
Okay,
believe.
great. So I'm just going to.
Actually, for the recording though, we'd love to have you read
Good
them.
idea, Wendy.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Gotcha. Yeah, so this says there's a state park on the coast. This is the only stretch of the coast in southeast Florida that shows the natural landscape. All other natural areas don't even come close. Reason the beachfront and adjacent inland is highly developed and extremely posh. This area is African American, dominated, was segregated in the past. Even now, this area is predominantly African American today. Because of this, a sustainably large or a substantially large amount of parcels were obtained and made into the segregated beach. This allows it to become a state park. Now it's only one of the only natural areas that bears any resemblance to the original state. Interesting. I didn't know any of this history. That's really interesting. The question is, how can such unjust areas be made into protected areas and use nature-based solutions while maintaining NEPA compliance? Yeah, I, I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding the question, but I wonder if the question is partly that if kind of creating protected areas, protected natural areas as part of the solution. And it, I don't, I guess I don't really have a good answer to that. I know that in the context of Norfolk, it's a highly developed or excuse me, populated area. There's not inside the city of Norfolk. It's bounded on all sides, either by water, by adjacent cities, or by the naval installation. So there's not a whole lot of kind of existing natural area. But I do know there's some new projects in terms of shifting easements, that as the water rises, the easements will automatically adjust back. This is something that the organization Wetlands Watch has been working at in order to try to encourage processes of managed retreat in a more systematic way to create this a larger wetlands buffer. So I'll leave it at that for that one. Question number two, I wonder if there's public pressure on the decision regarding public housing projects demolition and the city's normalizing of displacement of the occupants. Yes, so in the city of Norfolk, with the displacement you're referring to, I mentioned back on this slide here, the removal of the demolition of 2,200 units of public housing and the removal of nearly 5,500 residents. There was huge amount of pushback. There was a federal fair housing lawsuit that it ended up being settled out of kind of pre-trial. It was settled with a commitment by the city and the housing authority to build more units than it originally planned to build, although it's still not a one-to-one replacement. And there was even a documentary made by Soledad O'Brien, the former CNN journalist, made a documentary as a part of her series called Disrupt and Dismantle. It's an episode of her documentary miniseries focused precisely on this topic. I've done writing on this. Others have also done writing on this. And I will get some links to some writing on this in particular for the email, I believe that'll go out to all participants in the next day or two. I can send some additional resources for that. So Kyle asks, have I spoken to city officials running these projects? I've been very outspoken personally about this. I was an expert witness in the lawsuit on the side of the plaintiffs who were suing the city. I've written academically. I've written in the form of op-eds. I put together a museum exhibition. So I've been speaking very as loudly as I can on these issues, though the city is either not listening or ignoring. I don't know, but they're moving forward with this project as a part of their broader strategy once the lawsuit was settled a year or two ago. Next question, I'm looking here from Samuel. How adversely does land subsidence affect or contribute to sea level rise for Palm Beach County, Florida? The whole county is very flat. Coastal part is developed and rapidly growing. I would like to know the subsidence as well. I don't know anything about Palm Beach County, Florida in terms of subsidence. In Norfolk, I don't know the exact numbers, and there actually might be people on this call who know better than me the exact rate of subsidence, but it is substantial. It's one of Norfolk has, I mentioned the 1-2 punch of sea level rise and subsidence, but it's experiencing faster than average sea level rise and also faster than average land subsidence. And so it's created this really profound issue that we're facing.
Well,
I see. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to say that's it the last one, I believe.
Yeah, I was looking through the chat. It looks like some people can't see the
yeah, no, everyone can't see the chat, only the presenters.
Oh yeah, the slides. I will make my slides available to everyone. So the link will go out in tomorrow's email, I believe. Okay, so SP asks, I'm curious about your data collection for the public housing work. It's my understanding that Norfolk is only in the process of redeveloping one public housing community. Yeah, okay, thank you. That is true. There are 3 different public housing projects all right down in here in this area. The broader area is called St. Paul's Quadrant. The 3 public housing projects that are in that area are Tidewater Gardens, Young Terrace, and Calvert Square. The ultimate plan is to tear down all 3 of those public housing developments, which together are about 22 units of public housing. The census tracts there, which the only residencies in those census tracts are the public housing projects. The census tracts there have about 5,500 people total and 2,200 housing units. So the data is coming from the census and from HUD in terms of the total units in those projects. Up to this point, the only place where shovels are in the ground, so to speak, is in Tidewater Gardens specifically, which is, I think, between 550 and 600 units of public housing. So that's where that 618 number is coming from in the chat. So that's where they've already demolished all of Tidewater Gardens and started rebuilding. That's phase 1, and the subsequent phases they're going to be demolishing the rest to develop out that full project. If somebody says in the chat it's 1,700 units, you know, I don't have the data at my fingertips to dispute that, but 1700, 2200, let's call it 2000, and I'll look it up with more detail following this.
Well, I believe that's our last question. Dr. Finn, thank you so much for sharing this information with us. I found it, and I'm sure everyone on the call did, both inspiring and frankly thought-provoking. I know our conversation was about an East Coast community, but I think the lessons that you've learned can be applied in many areas. I know a number of us on this call are involved with mitigation planning or community action planning, and these are issues that really seriously need to be thought about in terms of how we go about those processes, not only in the communities we serve, but in the methods that we apply to understanding those communities, as some of the examples that you pulled out showed. I put in the chat that the slides will be made available. Dr. Finn has generously agreed to share those with us, and this is recorded. So please take the opportunity to share the recording, which should be posted in the next few days, with others that would be interested in this. Again, found it valuable, and really hope that everyone felt the same. Let me quickly share, if you don't mind, I'll need to share my screen for a moment. If you can stop sharing yours. Let me quickly share my screen, and I'll just tell you some quick things to wrap this up. Okay. Go. Gotta love that swap view setup, don't you? So does everyone see my screen that says URISA Fostering Excellence, I hope? Perfect. So just very quickly, this is one of many educational opportunities that URISA offers throughout the year. These are always changing. We have a whole new suite of webinars coming up over the next few months related to community resilience. Our community resilience work group is very strongly focusing on not just the physical and economic and environmental aspects of resilience, but also the social aspects, as evidenced by Dr. Finn's presentation today. So look for more great webinars on that topic over the coming months. And if you've got ideas, please, don't keep them to yourself. Please do share those. We'd love to hear from you. And even more so, we'd love to have you engage in our processes as well. Become part of URISA if you're not already. And if you are part of the organization, join the committee working on community resilience. We do a lot of important work that really has a very tangible benefit and impact on our communities. Coming up very soon, we'll be acknowledging the amazing work that our Excellence in GIS awards have recognized over the years, including one coming up on Pulaski area's GIS system in Arkansas and on Cuyahoga County's GIS system. URISA annually recognizes the great work of communities throughout the country, and this is your opportunity to hear about those activities. If you are not familiar with the GIS Leadership Academy, this is your opportunity to fill that gap. We've had a very successful run over the last few years of cadres of professionals attending the Leadership Academy, and that has led to an advanced GIS Leadership Academy now, the next offering of which is coming up actually very soon on Friday in Chicago, and more to follow. We also have a GIS Leadership Academy coming up in June in Seattle. Notice the bright red text says nearing capacity. If you're interested, don't wait, don't delay. Sign up now. And then we have another one coming up in November in Fort Worth, Texas, and yet another Chicago offering of the Advanced GIS Leadership Academy coming up in mid-August. And of course, I would be terribly negligent if I did not share with you the amazing conference called GIS Pro. This annual event brings together GIS professionals from all around the world to a location where they can share their stories about best practices, learn new skills and techniques in technology and application, and do all of that while having a great deal of fun in what is often, as will be the case this year, a beautiful location, this time being in Portland, Maine in October. And if you have not been in the Northeast in the fall, Northeast US, you have missed something that you need to address this time around. So for the 62nd annual conference, that will be October 7th to 10th in 2024. If you are a URISA member, hopefully you already are engaged in URISA's social networking platform or Connect platform. We stay in touch year around. I can't remember too many days going by when I did not hear from someone or something to do with what URISA is all about. So if you want to be part of that family, stay connected, get involved. All you have to do is join URISA. It will be one of the best decisions, in my opinion, that you will have made in your career. So with that, again, I will thank everyone and especially Dr. Finn for joining us today. This has been a rewarding session. I really appreciate your time. I've been looking forward to this for weeks, and you did not disappoint, my friend. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And with that, I will wish everyone a great day. Thanks.